Now, one thing that I'm going to do is I'm actually going to take that tank and I'm going to make it into a prefab. And the way you make a tank, any game object into a prefab is very easy. You just grab it, click on it, drag it down into your project view, let go, and now we have a prefab. So a prefab is, you can think of it like a blueprint for an object. So on a prefab is a game object. It can have other game objects underneath it. It can have scripts attached to it and so on, and we can instantiate this. So now, if I go and remove this tank from my scene, I still have the prefab down here in my project. And so what I can do is I can drag it up and drag the prefab up into the scene, and I can add as many tanks as I'd like. So now I have 4 tanks. You can't really see them because they're all right on top of each other, but if I go and I drag them apart, now you can see that we have 4 tanks. So that's very useful. Now, one thing that I don't really like about this tank at the moment is that it's white. And typically, a white tank is not going to be useful in many places other than if you're trying to sneak up on someone in Antarctica. So typically you see tanks, they're usually a brown color or maybe a green color or so on. So we're going to have a look and see what we can do about that. Now, if we take a look at the tank itself, as I said before, is just a game object. There's nothing special about it. The individual pieces of the tank, however, are actual 3D objects. So you can see we have our cube for the tank body, our dome here for or our sphere for the tank dome, and the cylinder for the tank gun. And if you look on these 3D objects, you'll see a bunch of components. That's what each one of these little drop-down things are. Every game object has a transform. A game object can't exist without a transform component. But the other components are dependent on what type of object it is. So on this cube, we have a box collider, which allows us to set up physics on this cube if we want to, or allow things to collide with it. We also have a mesh renderer. Now, the mesh renderer is the thing that draws the cube. And on this mesh renderer, you can see this little materials list. And under materials, you can see default material. So when you create a primitive in Unity, you end up with a default material on it. And the default material you can actually see listed right down here. So if you expand this out, this is our default material. And it's quite useful for quickly prototyping something. But you can see everything down here is grayed out. So I can't actually click anything and change anything. That's because the default material is exactly what it is. It's just a default material, and you can't do anything further with it. So I'm going to come over to my project view, and I'm going to create a material that I can change. So first of all, just to make my my OCD quiet down, I'm actually going to organize my folder over here a little bit better. So I'm going to create a prefabs folder, drop my tank prefab in there, and now I'm going to create another folder for materials, and in here I'm going to right click, I'm going to say create, and I'm going to go to material. So I have this new material. I'm going to name it tank material, or tank, let's say tank chassis. Okay, so now we have a material called tank chassis. Now you can see the material now we can change a bunch of things about it. Now most of these things get into some slightly more advanced topics when it comes to graphics in Unity specifically, and graphics programming in general. So I'm not going to get into that today. I just wanted to point out, you can see the shader list here, and there's lots of different shaders you can choose from. The standard shader is the one that you'd most often want to go with. You can change the rendering mode, so we can do things like make the material transparent or allow for cutouts. So if we wanted to have some windows in our tank, then we could change the rendering mode. I won't get too deep into that. The only thing that we really want to be messing around with right now is this guy right here, which is the color. So the albedo color specifically, that's the color of the material. Now I'm actually not going to change that directly right now. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go over here to my tank. I'm going to click on the tank body. I'm going to drag that material over onto here. So now that part of the tank has this material. And now if I come in here and I change the color, I'm going to choose a nice dark green. And now we can see that the tank body is turning a nice shade of dark green. Now the other parts are not green. That's because they're still using the default material. So now if I go and I bring tank chassis over there and over here, now they're all sharing the same material. And so we have our nice little green tank. Now I could have changed the color from over here, but the reason that I wanted to drop it on the tank first was to show you that so you could actually see the color changing on the tank as we modified it. So now if I go and I modify it further, then you can see me make a nice sky blue tank, for example. But I'm going to leave it this nice shade of dark green for now. So now we have that tank. Now we've made a change to the tank right in here. Now I didn't make the change to the tank prefab. If you take a look at the prefab, it's still white down here. We want to make sure that our tanks going forward all have the tank chassis as their material. So one way I could have done that is I could have actually made the change to the tank prefab. The tricky thing there is that it doesn't let you get at every sub piece of the game object hierarchy. As you can see in this prefab, you can see the tank, you can see the tank body and the tank dome, but I can't get down to the tank gun. But the tank gun does, in fact, have its own mesh renderer. So, because I had an instance of that prefab in this scene, I made the change there, and then what I can do is I can click Apply. And what Apply does is it goes and takes any changes I've made to this instance of the prefab, and it makes it to the core prefab. So now we have a tank that is green, and that is our prefab. So now if we go and we add some more tanks and we drag those around, now we have green tanks. There's the beginning of our little army. Now of course in Scorched Earth we don't have a bunch of tanks that are on the same side. We want to be able to distinguish tanks from one another. We want there to be multiple tanks, and we want them to all be different colors. So, what we're going to do first is, instead of dropping a bunch of tanks into our scene, we're actually going to create something that can create for us as many tanks as we'd like. So, we're going to create our first script. So we're going to come in here, create a folder. We're going to call this scripts. And inside of here, I'm going to create a C# script. And we're going to call this thing a tank spawner. It's going to spawn tanks. So now, if I come in here and I double click, then that should load up tank spawner in my Visual Studio window. Here we go. So here we are in Visual Studio. So now we have this thing called a tank spawner. It's a mono behavior. So anything that we want to attach to a game object in Unity is going to derive from this base class mono behavior. There are these functions start and update, and those are special functions for mono behaviors. As the names imply, start is used for initializing things, and update is used for doing updates every frame on our objects. So in our tank spawner here, first of all, I'm going to fix some of the line endings here. Just a second. Boop. Boop. Okay, so now we have our tank spawner. Now, we're not actually going to be doing anything in our update in the tank spawner, because our tank spawner is just there to be able to drop things into our world. We're going to initialize it with as many tanks as we want to see, and we're going to drop them into the world. So, we're actually going to get rid of the update. There's no real reason for it to be there, and it actually can use up a few cycles. So it's a good idea if you're going. It's generally speaking, it's a good idea to not have empty functions in your projects. So what we're going to do is in our tank spawner, we're going to say public int number of tanks. So this is the number of tanks that we want to spawn. Now, by making it public, this is going to be something that we can actually edit in the inspector. So let's go back here. So now we can see from this little quick view here, we have our updated script. So now I'm actually going to come in here to the hierarchy, and I'm going to create an empty game object. And I'm going to put it at 0, 0, 0, and I'm going to call it tank spawner. Now, I'm going to add to that tank spawner the script that we just wrote. There's a couple ways to do that. You can click on add component here. Then add component gives you a whole list of things you can choose from, including you can see scripts right here, and if I go under scripts I can see tank spawner. Another way to do it is you can literally just click and drag the script right on top of the game object. So now we have the tank spawner script on our game object, and you can see that the number of tanks has been exposed. So now I can either click and drag right here to change it, or I can actually just set it to a value, and that's that. So let's set it to 5. And now if I run the game, absolutely nothing happens. And that's to be expected, because we haven't actually told our tank spawner to do anything yet. We just exposed a variable. It doesn't work by magic, unfortunately. So let's come back in here. So now let's do some actual creation of tanks. Now the first thing we're going to need to know is we need to know what is a tank. What do we want to actually create in here? So we're also going to tell our tank spawner about that tank prefab that we created. So we're going to say public game object tank prefab. So that's the blueprint that this tank spawner is going to use to create lots of copies of tanks. Now, just for safety's sake, I'm going to put in a check here to say if number of tanks is less than or equal to 0, then we just want to return. Because we don't want to get into any chance of having weirdness happen. Actually, no, we don't. We actually don't need this check. I was a little worried about negative numbers resulting in infinite loops, but it won't, because we're actually going to just use a for loop. So for int I equals 0, I less than number of tanks plus plus I, or you can say I plus plus. Plus plus I is an old habit of mine from the days of C++, where it is actually possible for plus plus on an object to be a little faster than that object plus plus. I don't think that the same actually holds true for the way that C# handles increment. Anyway, so inside of this for loop, we are going to say game object new tank object equals instantiate tank prefab. Now, if we save this and we go back to Unity, now it's going to compile, and we are actually going to get, oh, we got a warning. It's assigned, but it's never used. That's okay. That makes sense. So what we've done is we've just instantiated this number of the tank prefab. Now we can see the tank prefab has been exposed here. We haven't actually set it to anything yet, so we need to remember to drag our tank prefab and drop it right there. So if we run the game now, what we can see is we can see that our tank spawner has created 5 tanks. They're named tank clone, and they all exist in our little game view here. Now, we can't actually tell that there's 5 tanks because they've all shown up on the exact same place, or in the exact same place. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to go back to our script, and we are going to actually make some changes so that we can actually tell our tanks apart here. So one thing that we're going to do is we're actually going to give our tank objects a name. So we're going to say new tank object dot name equals tank plus I dot toString, and I'm just going to give this a format string. So D2, all D2 means is I want the number to be formatted as 2 characters with a leading 0. If you look up C# string format specifications, then you can find all of that kind of stuff in there. D2 is one of the ones that I use the most for things that I know I'll never have more than 99 of, and at least in our little demo today, we're not going to have more than 99 tanks. So we're going to put that in. The other thing that we're going to do is we're going to actually move our tanks around so we can see them. So we're going to say vector3 position equals new vector3, and we're going to call random.range -10 0 on the y, because y is up and down. Oh, sorry, no. Random.range 10, yeah, -10 to 10. So we're picking an x value in the range -10 to 10. 0 on our y, because we just want them all to be sitting on the ground for now. And random.range -10, 10. So now we can actually set our new tank object dot transform dot position to that position that we've just created. So if we save that and we head back to Unity, we can see this little spinning bulb down here means that things are being compiled. So now I'm actually going to, while I'm here, I'm going to change my main camera, because the main camera doesn't give us a really great view. So let's take our main camera, let's bring it up in the air a little bit, maybe up to 4, and then we're going to actually rotate it around the camera's x-axis by 30 degrees. That should give us a slightly better view on things. So now when we run the game, we have our tank spawner set up to spawn 5 tanks. Ah, there are our tanks. If we go to the scene view, we can actually see some of those tanks are just outside of the camera's view. So we actually probably want to pull that main camera back somewhat. Let's pull back to about right there. So that's 9.16, -18.95. So, okay, so when we stop running, that's going to reset itself back. But I'm going to say 9 and -18. Okay, so now when we run, hopefully we'll have a much better view of our little battlefield, and we'll be able to see all of our tanks. Good. So our tanks appear now separated. They're in a random 20 by 20 area because it goes from -10 to 10 and -10 to 10 on the Z as well.